Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston.
We're your hosts and real-life sisters who binge on historical drama.
We'll talk about films, fictional adaptations, and dramatic series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
So fill your teacup or mug with your favorite sip as we explore what's fact, what's fiction, and the so what on historical drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical films and dramatic series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. Listen to past episodes and sign up for our newsletter on our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters to stay up to date on new episodes and bonus content.
In this podcast, we continue our conversation about Vikings Valhalla with medieval scholar Nahir Otaño Gracia, whose Global North Atlantic extends the Viking story from the North Sea to the Iberian Peninsula, Mediterranean, and the tip of North Africa. We focus on how the Vikings' travels and encounters changed their culture and destinies, including the characters in Vikings Valhalla. Set over 1,000 years ago in the early 11th century, Vikings Valhalla chronicles the exploits of the most famous Vikings from history. The legendary explorer Leif Erikson, played by Sam Corlett, his courageous warrior sister Freydis Eriksdotter, played by Frida Gustafsson, and the ambitious Nordic prince Harald Sigurdsson, played by Leo Suter. Season 2 begins after the tragic fall of Kattegat, an event that has shattered the main characters' dreams and altered their destinies. Finding themselves suddenly fugitives in Scandinavia, Leif, Harald, and Freydis are forced to test their ambitions and courage in worlds beyond the fjords of Kattegat. The first and second seasons of Vikings Valhalla are currently streaming on Netflix with the third season in production.
Our guest, Nahir Otaño Gracia, is assistant professor of English at the University of New Mexico and a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies located in Princeton, New Jersey. Her theoretical frameworks include critical race studies, translation theory and practice, and the global North Atlantic, extending the North Atlantic to include the Iberian Peninsula and Africa. She has published several articles on literatures written in Middle English, Old Castilian, Old Catalan, Old Irish, and Old Norse-Icelandic, and they have appeared in journals such as Arthuriana, Comitatus, Enarratio, English Language Notes, and Viator. Her essay, Towards a Decentered Global North Atlantic, won the 2022 Medieval Academy of America Article Prize in Critical Race Studies.
Welcome, Nahir, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel honored.
How did you become interested in medieval literature and medieval studies?
Well, I became interested in medieval studies in probably my last year as an undergraduate student at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras. I did my bachelor's in comparative literature and French, and the department hired a new medievalist. And she taught the courses of, the sort of survey courses of medieval literature. And then she taught a master's course on Vikings. And so I was encouraged to take these courses, and I just fell in love. I fell in love with the literature. Chrétien de Troyes was my first sort of text I read that I was just amazed. I didn't understand that people would write this way or they would talk this way. And then when I did the Viking course, I loved it. And so that changed my life. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to study Caribbean literature, which is what I was training for. I was preparing, learning French. Spanish and English so that I could do the Caribbean. And suddenly I went to grad school and I said, no, I want to be a medievalist. And I still work on the Caribbean. I do medievalisms in Puerto Rico because that's also who I am. But I am now a medievalist. That's where I started.
I just want to let our audience know that we're all in cities right now, so we're going to have a little bit of city noise and activity behind us. But we believe it or not, we didn't expect we would enjoy and get so interested in medieval studies and Vikings history um, until we saw these series on Netflix, Vikings Valhalla, and also the Viking series that's now on Amazon Prime. But one thing that really is intriguing to Queen and I is you talk about the global North Atlantic in your scholarship. I don't know if you coin phrased that yourself, but while watching Vikings Valhalla and the Viking series, yeah, I try to imagine what that map looked like in those times. So tell us more about what is the global North Atlantic and what did that map or world look like? What cultures were encountered and engaged before the end of the Viking era in 1066?
Yeah, so I did coin the term global North Atlantic. So my research is a little later. I look at Arthurian literature written in different languages. And so I was seeing a phenomenon um, that was also coming because I've read the Viking stories and I read the family sagas and these materials. And I was seeing that there was an engagement of the Atlantic to the rest of, the southern borders of Europe, of what we call now the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean, right? I was seeing these connections and seeing that, when we think about Vikings, we imagine them sort of the North Atlantic, we imagine it as the very top of the North Atlantic. But if you look in a map, the North Atlantic includes the Iberian Peninsula and it includes the north of Africa and it gives us access to the Mediterranean. And what I see is that these people, the Norse, they were very interested in participating in the movements happening in the Mediterranean, happening in North Africa, happening in the Iberian Peninsula, and wanted to very much be a part of that. And so my idea of the global North Atlantic also wants to push against this vision of a homogeneous Viking ideology, the idea that they were just sort of hidden away over there. That wasn't the case. They traveled, they went everywhere, but they were changed by those interactions. And so by pointing out and seeing those changes, seeing the ways that Vikings traveled to the peninsula, to Al Andalus, is imperative to truly understand the ways that Vikings have changed the rest of the world, but also have been changed by that.
Yes, those encounters between cultures
Mhm.
really, I think, bust the myth that there's any such thing as a pure culture. That peoples have always been influencing each other.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, they have.
So I appreciate that you take a view of that literature and history that is inclusive of identities that certainly when I was taking world history, we didn't learn anything about. And that includes race and ethnicity and sex and gender. So, as you think about the work that you've done and your teaching, how does including those identities reshape the story about medieval times, literature, the arts, and history um, that, as I said, wasn't what I was taught, and I think a lot of people still have a view of that world that is very limited and narrow.
Yeah. I see my work as what I like to think of it as recovery work
Mm.
because it was always there, right? I am not going into these materials and doing my research and finding something, let's say something new. I'm looking at the texts and materials that we have been looking at for a very long time. and pointing out what's there. But that previous scholars were simply saying, well, that doesn't count. Somehow that's not real because these things didn't really exist. The Middle Ages were white, the Middle Ages were the same. And so every time you see something different, you say, well, that's an exception. That doesn't count. And so part of what I see I'm doing is recovery work of showing that that image of a sort of, again, a homogeneous Europe wasn't the case. And so I see this it, as a branch. I feel like we're a branch now. There's several scholars, many of us doing this work together. And so we're branching out and demonstrating um, what I see as the reality of what it was, which was complicated and messy and exciting. And I think part of what I like about what these shows are doing is I, you know, the sort of the medievalist and historian in me is a little bit always like, no, that's not right.
Yeah.
But the sentiment of that messiness and like showing, that people were very different, that there was all that it wasn't all white, the Vikings were actually not homogeneous. All of that is very exciting to me. And so it kind of shows me how, sometimes we have, shows that the things that we say are historical seem very wrong, but they still get the ethos right. And so I'm kind of excited about that.
Yeah, yeah. This everything that isn't factual doesn't mean it isn't true. So, it kind
Yeah.
of kind of gets the spirit of what the times are like, which I think Michelle and I are really appreciating.
And we have to remember that Vikings Valhalla, the chronology is all over the place,
Yes, it is.
but but the characters are there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I often think of, you know, I have to wonder, it was like if a person from the Middle Ages would like our shows, and then I remember it's like, but it's not for them. This is for us, right?
Right.
But it is exciting to see that it's it's giving credence to the reality that Europe was multi-ethnic, was multicultural, was and the Vikings themselves were not just a group of people, and that to me is very valuable.
Yeah. So in that first season of Vikings Valhalla, there's a port city of Kattegat. And port cities have always been interesting to me because they often are the spaces where people of diverse cultures encounter each other, engage each other in more peaceful ways than just the warfare we often see. Um, and in the series, you see people who appear to be of African, Asian, Middle Eastern descent, as well as Europeans,
Mhm.
or who we traditionally characterize as Europeans, because we've also talked to an artist, um, Glory Samjali, who has a platform called Black Aristocrats, where she's challenging that narrative about uh, people of African descent in Europe. How diverse was that medieval world, and what role did cities that like Kattegat, those port cities or those trade cities, play in terms of advancing those encounters between cultures and peoples?
They were incredibly diverse. I mean, it's hard to think about numbers, right? But we do know that the ports were there was so much work going on. We talk about idea of a lingua franca, ideas of like there was ways in which these different ports learned to communicate with each other. Um, so it was incredibly important in my own work. One of the things I point out is that if you actually look at the trade routes and the spice routes, especially through the waterways, it actually mimics the ways that literature moved. As I said, I work on Arthurian literature, and you can actually trace how the movement of spices and trades is also the movement of the stories, the Arthurian stories. And so it absolutely shows us that it wasn't just these ports weren't just moving objects, right? They were moving people and their stories and their ideas, and it's all connected. And 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 they show that things very quickly were sort of reshaped for these different cultures, and port cities are imperative for that. So absolutely, the idea of these cities having to, I guess, rethink themselves a little bit because of that sort of contact with cultures is very true. So it's exciting to see how they're trying to portray that in the show.
That makes me think about, and this may be really off the mark, but fruitcake. And I always say what I love about fruitcake is that it seems to contain the history of so many different places and times because it appeals to palates that are Middle Eastern, that are European, that are African, that are Caribbean. And I said, it must have come together at some point in history. And I keep thinking it's medieval times or somewhere there, when you talk about the waterways and literature and spices.
Yes, I don't know anything about fruitcake, so I don't. But that sounds so right to me. I mean, I can talk a little bit about in Puerto Rico. We love coconut and spices, and one of our favorite drinks, el coquito. It has anise, it has canela, cinnamon, it has nutmeg, and like if you look and but it also has condensed milk, right? And that condensed milk comes from from the US. It's a sort of a US imposition, but the spices are coming from contact between Al Andalus and Iberian Peninsula and Africa. And so our absolutely our meals have a continue to have that sort of to hold all of that history together in how they're presented and in the way they change. So I absolutely believe that fruitcake could absolutely do this.
What in Vikings Valhalla, we are very impressed. I think it spoiled us for how women are portrayed in historical drama now, no longer the victim.
Right. Or the
we
damsel in distress to
or the
be
damsel in
rescued.
distress. We have shield maidens. We have women warriors like Freydis. We have Jarl Estrid Haken, who's played by Caroline Henderson, who talks about her North African or Alexandria roots. We have Norman born Queen Emma, who's a historical figure in English history, played by Laura Berlin, and a female astronomer and scholar, Mariam, played by Hayat Camille. Are there any literary or historical references of that time that would support this representation of women? Do you know what they are? And what does that literature say about how women engaged in scholarship, warfare, and governance in those times?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot, especially in the literature that I look at. There's a lot of materials, right? The family sagas are filled with exceptional and exciting women that are doing exceptional and exciting things. But not just the family sagas, right? Like we see the um, uh, Leif and his sister, right? Like she they are her name escapes me right now, I'm sorry. Leif's sister's name,
Freydis.
Freydis.
Freda, right?
Yeah.
They're in the sagas and incredibly well traveled characters, right? The idea of a woman, she went to Iceland, she went to Greenland, she went to the Americas, she went on pilgrimage, right? So and this is in the sagas that all these travel, and we have also text sort of like old Irish stories, such as the Cycle, and these stories we see also woman warriors, we see woman poets, and so it's really everywhere in the stories that we see these women just being deeply engaged in politics. Historically speaking, they were deeply engaged in the politics. They were deeply engaged in everyday life, right? And so, just like today, I often think of we have to separate sort of the ideas of like our patriarchal societies that want to, imagine the world in a male-centered way, but then women thriving despite oppression, women thriving and doing the work, and also the role of women in their communities and the community needs that women constantly serve. So all of that is is always there. It was there in the Middle Ages. It is there now, and these stories show all of this. Of course, it doesn't always show it, I think, in a fair way. We can often see that there might be a male um, I guess, um, um, we can see that there might be that the writer might be a man, and so some of the ideas I would not agree with. But you can also always see sort of these drops of like incredibly women doing incredible things, and I think that's part of with my students that I try to show them is let's take all of it in. We can show all of the complexities of these literatures and what they're doing. Just like we are incredibly complex, and we can't just it doesn't serve us to try to just put things in sort of corners and borders, as opposed to say there is a lot of complexity that we can draw out of this text, and they're just exciting. They're just exciting women to find.
Yeah.
It's great that you can find it through the male gaze, so to speak, in the
Yeah.
text.
Yeah. And I also understand that there are women who were writing during that time and creating stories as well.
Yes.
Their names may not be as well known, but they certainly were there and they certainly were creating those
And not
stories that traveled through time as well as space.
Yes, some well-known writers are Marie de France, Christine de Pizan. Um, we also have a lot of anonymous texts.
Hmm.
So the saga of the people of Laxdala is a saga that it has been put forward the idea that a woman might have written it because it does center very much on the lives of the women of the Laxdala family. And so that's something that has been put forward. It's an anonymous text. We don't know who wrote it. Why do we assume that a man must have written this text? So there is a lot out there, and we just don't do enough to actually center it.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Share this podcast. Join our historical drama community by signing up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content.
Now, back to our podcast conversation. One of the driving plots of the series we've been watching, and I think it's been a driving plot in the history I learned, was that this was a time of very violent conflict between what's termed in Vikings Valhalla the old religion or paganism and Christianity. So you have the character Olaf, who became a saint. I'm not sure how that happened, why they would canonize him, because even the historical texts don't depict him as a very saintly person. But he sees himself as being on a divine path to convert people, often by killing all the Vikings or heathens who still worship the pagan gods. And then you have Freydis, the Greenlander, Leif Erikson's sister, who's a woman warrior. She's also on a divine path, and she's seen as a keeper, protector of the faith. And she sees her role as trying to preserve the traditions of the old religion. And because of those stories, we tend to see that period and religion as the root cause of historical conflicts, including the violent warfare and the attempts to dominate the land and peoples. Well, what was the role of religion and religious conflicts in those cultural, political, and social struggles of the time, including that drive for land ownership, wealth, and status?
That's a big question. I mean, again, the religion and power are very intertwined, right? And it varies. Um, I think from person to person, probably, but as a scholar of literature, for me, it varies from text to text, right? Um, but what I see that is clear to me is that you know there are people who truly are and were religious, right, and they believe in the tenets of their religion, and there were people that were using those religions for their own political means, right. um, and you can see this, in my own research. There's I study a text called Guy of Warwick. It's a 12th century text, and it's telling the story of Warwick. And in the story, in the original sort of Anglo-Norman French versions, the enemies are the Danes. And then in the 15th century, a Catalan writer, Joanot Martorell, he rewrites this story. He rewrites it in Catalan, and in this new version, the enemies are now Muslims, right?
Mm.
Yes. And so you see a shift from the pagan enemies, the Danes, to these Muslim enemies later on, um, in this new rewriting of these stories. And so what I often find is that a lot of these stories are are sort of talking about these sort of pagan enemies, and and then it switches to Muslim enemies, because by then also, there's this idea that the pagan enemies, if they're especially if they're coming from the north, they can be Christianized, and that they are Christianized, and then they're one of us. But uh, it, it, that does not follow with Muslims and the stories being told about Muslims. So one of the things that the texts that I study show me is a progression of the ways that religion, especially Christianity, was used as a tool to create difference between Christians and other groups. And pagans was one of those, and Muslims and Jews were others. Um, and that it has really negative repercussions, right? And so in that sense, that was terrible. So I think that they're in very ways are very much intertwined, and we just it becomes difficult to parse out which parts, when we can talk and say, well, this is just about power and this is just about religion, because it was so much uh, used in tandem with each other.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating, I think, the power of those stories to help shape kind of a political agenda as well. And also that religion also has been used by folks who are oppressed as a way of advancing power as well. So that agency and power in religion, I think, that you lifted up is right on target.
What I see in the storytelling of Vikings Valhalla and the Vikings series, too, is that, well, they use the Viking religion did human sacrifices. So I know that does not exactly work for everyone. But what the series seem to be doing is they're these bridge people who are saying, I do, you do you, and I do me.
Mhm.
And they're the ones who seem to be moving the stories forward versus the ones who stay stuck in their positions, religious positions. Can you say anything about Viking religion or the pagan religion and its transformation, or how that rollover to Christianity happened?
Let me see. So the family sagas talk often about sort of for example, in Iceland, that the Icelanders became they kind of voted, in the all thing, they came together, and basically the way I understand is the change was happening, right. Norway um, puts the Icelanders under their sort of power, and so these changes are happening, and so they kind of say, okay, we'll become Christian, but you can you can still practice in private, right? And then that really changes, and they're sort of all forced to be Christian, right? So it becomes, I guess, a private affair is a way to put it. um, so that change absolutely happens, and I think one of the tensions in the family sagas is that they're writing these sagas about a past that's no longer there, about a time period in which the sagas they're free, they're their own people, but now they're under the control of the Norwegian king, and they have a new religion, and so they're also dealing with the tensions of all these changes that the community is going through. Um, so that's, I think, as much as I can say. I would say, the idea of when I was because I looked at the Vikings Valhalla show and I was watching it, and two things that really struck me was, yeah, they talk about the human sacrifice, but then they also show these sort of very Christian characters also being incredibly violent, right? And so I thought he made a really nice comment about the idea of like which one is more violent about the way that they're treating each other. Um, and I really like that in the end of the second season, you have Freja really coming to terms with her role, right?
Yes.
And so I, again, like I said, as a medievalist, there was a part of me like, well, I don't know if any of this is how real I can say this is, but this is fun. Great, yes, go. As, take over your role and accept it. I love it. So I don't know. They're doing. I felt like that they were doing a really good job for you to root for these characters and to be able to thrive. And sort of, I'm not like I don't think they're gonna do very well though. Like, what's season 3 gonna come? I don't know.
In the second season of Vikings Valhalla, we're introduced to Islam through Mariam, an astrologer. I'm sorry, an astronomer. She's a little bit of an astrologer too, a scholar who teaches Leif Erikson about navigation, and she teaches him how to read. It is noted that early Islamic culture was more tolerant of religious diversity. Was there a time in the medieval period when various religious, I think we already covered this, when various religious beliefs coexisted and influenced each other? And I think you probably answered that in my last question. Um, but let's talk about Miriam a little more. What did you think of this character? I mean, she's representative here. She's a woman, she's Muslim, she's educated, and um,
And she's a
you know,
scholar.
scholar. And spoiler alert, she may have some property.
Yeah. Um, I thought she was great. Like I said, one of the things um, I want to emphasize is that Vikings were changed by other interactions. And here's a character that's clearly going to change, leave. She's going to change him. Clearly, she taught him things, and he's going to bring this back. And this knowledge is going to be used somehow. Like, I don't know yet how, but it's going to be used. And so I'm like, this is exactly, again, when I was saying that the ethos is there, this is the exact kind of ethos that I want to show. Vikings were changed by their interactions. They went to Al Andalus, and they interacted with people from Al Andalus and Muslims, and these interactions changed them. And yes, Al Andalus was one of the most diverse spaces, but also most religious tolerant spaces, right? And like all like us now, right? There's a lot of struggles when you have a lot of people that have different beliefs and are different from each other. It's messy, right?
Yes.
But that's my favorite part. I thrive in messy because that is the spaces where we all come together. And so Vikings were part of that, and they were changed by these interactions. And so for her, she kind of represents all these things that I want people to get about the Middle Ages. She does that by teaching him, right? So I think she's like, this is the best. I love it. Um, and some of the way that she's represented does not go against some not always positive portrayals, but portrayals of Muslims as very well learned and able to change the history, right? And that fear that they could do that. And so I'm quite loving that she's there. I thought that was really well done. at least for me.
Yeah, and it was fascinating the instruments that she was introducing that helped, even though these Vikings are very well known for their navigation skills, but it was like, oh, you can do better if you have this tool. And I thought that was fascinating too. So, one of the things that when the Dark Ages, quote unquote, is a term used in referring to the medieval period. But obviously, it's more complex than that. Obviously, like any human history or civilization or culture, there's, the mix. There are bright spots as well as those, parts that we would rather we'd made different choices, right? But what were some of the other bright spots? You've already mentioned a number of them, but what are some other bright spots from the medieval period? And of those times, what is still with us in terms of our own culture and our own ethos?
Yeah, I so of the Middle Ages is that for me it was a time it was a time in which the world could have been very different. Things in the Middle Ages, there were all kinds of genders. For example, asexuality was a gender. Um, there were ways in which the world could have been completely different. In the Middle Ages, the identities that we have today were starting to be formed, but other identities well as well. So it was a time of possibility. We could have been our our history could have been completely different. It wasn't. We have the history that we have, but when we studied the Middle Ages, we can say all bets are off. What is happening here? How are we going to understand identity? How are we going to understand what's happening? And it does not have to look at all what we have now. We can sit with not understanding and doing the work of like very difficult work of being uncomfortable because we are never going to know exactly what is happening. And to me, that is the most exciting thing about studying the Middle Ages, that it was a time of possibility. And we can go then from there and say, what can we now make possible that is different from what we have? And to me, that's what makes my job so exciting, is that I get to do that with my students every day in the classroom. And the worlds that they come up with that could be possible is always more than I could have imagined. And I get to do that with them because I get to study the Middle Ages.
Fabulous.
I want to hold that pause because that's going to be the last word before. We are now in our lightning round. And these are questions that we ask all our guests on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters that connect with the themes of this podcast and the topic we're discussing as well. And I'm going to ask the first question. Are you ready,
Okay.
Nahir? Okay, Nahir, if you could go back in time, it doesn't have to be Viking times or medieval times, but if it is, that's fine. What time would that be, and who would you be?
Oh man. Well, I think I probably would have wanted to be a Viking. Let's be honest.
A shield maiden or a jarl?
Oh my god. I think I probably would have wanted it. I mean, not really. I know that once I actually live that life, I would be like never, but definitely when I started to look at these texts, I was like, I want to be a Viking. This is awesome. So I absolutely bought into it.
Fascinating. So, our second question is, in that, we're all living history in a sense. What three items would you put in a time capsule that reflect your life and the times you've lived through?
Probably put my phone because he has everything in it. um, I would put my agenda because it gets me through everything. But also, again, historians would appreciate knowing all that data about like what I did what and what dates and how that worked. So I think historians would appreciate to have my agenda. And I think I would um, also bring, I would also put my favorite dress because it's really comfy and it makes me happy when I wear it. So
What does it look like?
it has flowers and is kind of like it's you just kind of slip it on, but it has some shape to it, so it makes me feel like you know, like it makes me feel like I'm in spring at all times, and so I like it.
Color?
I guess white with lots of flowers in different colors.
Oh, that does
So
sound pretty and
Yeah.
spring-like. Well, Nair, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation about Vikings and Vikings Valhalla. And we're looking forward to seeing some of your work and reading some of your work so that we can have a deeper understanding and expand this framing around these series and this history and the literature. Thank you so much.
thank you so much for having me.
To our audience, you can listen to part 1 of our Vikings Valhalla podcast. That's episode 30, and get a viewer perspective of Vikings Valhalla and Vikings series and films from Alex Chisnell, host of the podcast Screw It, Just Do It, and the person who helped us launch this podcast.
If you see one of these Viking boats up close, you'll be gobsmacked at the size of them, and you just think, how did people come across the weather that we have in the North Sea, and then to America? I mean, it's just crazy. But I think Vikings is more authentic. It really portrays that life was hard and violent, and Vikings Valhalla takes it to another level.
We invite you to share this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters with someone you know who would enjoy the conversation. Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters and enjoy past episodes wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.
Visit our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters for more information and resources related to this and other podcast episodes.
Sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content. You can write us at podcast@michonnebostongroup.com. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston. Thank you for listening.